Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is ShadowScript. Tonight, we take you deep into the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the silence hides screams and the shadows never stay still. These aren't just stories, they're warnings whispered by the forest, echoed by the wind, and buried beneath the trails where no one dares to walk twice. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to ShadowScript, your home for the darkest horror stories on the internet. Because what you hear tonight, you won't forget tomorrow. Now lock your doors, kill the lights, and don't look outside. These are the 10 most terrifying Appalachian mountain horror stories ever told. The darkness swallowed their flashlight beams like hungry mouths as the 4 hikers descended into what locals called the Cursed Valley of Pine Hollow. What they found there would haunt their dreams forever, if they lived to have any. It began with a scream that wasn't human. Jackson wiped the sweat from his brow despite the October chill that cut through his jacket like ice-cold fingers. The Canadian wilderness stretched endlessly around them, but something felt wrong about this particular stretch of forest. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like midnight. "This map has to be from the 1800s, muttered Oliver, the British exchange student whose pale complexion had grown even whiter since they'd left the main trail 3 hours ago. His voice carried an edge of panic that made the others exchange worried glances. "Maps don't lie," replied Dakota, their American group leader, though her confident tone wavered as she studied the yellowed parchment. "Pine Hollow mining settlement should be just over this ridge." The 4th member of their group, Finn from Australia, suddenly grabbed Dakota's arm with such force that she nearly dropped the map. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something bordering on terror. They all stopped breathing. From somewhere deep beneath their feet came a sound that made their skin crawl. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in hushed tones that seemed to seep through the earth itself. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable: desperation, pleading, crying out for something just beyond comprehension. "Underground mining tunnels," Dakota said quickly, but her voice shook. "It's just acoustics. Sound carries weird in these old mountain formations." But as they crested the ridge, what they saw below made their blood turn to ice. Pine Hollow wasn't just abandoned, it was perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped the moment the last resident walked away. Wooden buildings stood intact, their windows still holding glass that reflected nothing. A single main street ran between them, flanked by a general store, a saloon, and what appeared to be a small church whose bell tower stretched toward the gray sky like an accusing finger. "This is impossible," Oliver whispered. "What structures from the 1800s should be rotted away by now." The voices grew louder as they descended into the settlement. Not louder in volume, but in intensity, as if whatever was speaking beneath the ground was growing more agitated by their presence. Jackson pulled out his phone to take pictures, but the screen remained black. "No signal," he muttered. But that wasn't unusual in the Canadian wilderness. What was unusual was how his phone felt ice-cold to the touch, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. They walked down the main street in single file, their footsteps echoing strangely in the silence above ground while the murmuring below continued unabated. Dakota pushed open the door to the general store, and the rusty hinges screamed in protest. Inside, shelves still held goods, canned foods with labels so faded they were unreadable, bolts of cloth that should have been eaten by moths decades ago, and behind the counter, an old ledger book lay open, as if someone had just been writing in it. Finn approached the ledger with trembling hands. The last entry was dated September 15th, 1887, and written in shaking hand. "The voices won't stop. They're calling us down. God help us, they're calling us all down." "We need to leave," Oliver said suddenly, backing toward the door. "We need to leave right now." But as they turned to go, they heard something that stopped them cold, their own voices, speaking from somewhere deep underground, calling out words they hadn't yet spoken. "Help us," came Jackson's voice from beneath the floorboards, though Jackson stood frozen above ground. "We can't get out." Dakota's voice pleaded from the depths, though Dakota was pressing herself against the store's wall in terror. The tunnel collapsed. Finn's voice echoed up through the earth, though Finn was backing toward the door with wide, horrified eyes. "They won't let us leave." Oliver's voice wailed from below, though Oliver was standing right beside them, his face white as death. The underground voices grew more frantic, more desperate, calling out in their own voices, speaking their own words, telling their own story of being trapped beneath Pine Hollow with no way out. And then they understood the horrible truth. The voices beneath weren't calling to them, they were calling from them, from some other version of themselves that had already descended into the tunnels, already been trapped, already become part of Pine Hollow's eternal collection of the lost. As this realization hit them, the wooden floor began to crack beneath their feet. Long spiderweb fractures spread across the boards, and through the gaps, they could see light flickering far below, lantern light, as if people were moving through tunnels with old-fashioned mining lamps. "The floor is going to collapse," Dakota screamed, but her voice seemed to come from two places at once, from her throat and from somewhere deep in the earth below. They ran for the door, but had swung shut and wouldn't budge. The windows were suddenly boarded up from the outside, though no one had been there to board them. They were trapped in the general store while their own voices pleaded from the depths below, telling them about tunnel collapses and endless wandering in the dark. Jackson threw his full weight against the door, and it finally burst open, sending him tumbling into the street. The others followed, gasping in the cold mountain air, but their relief was short-lived. The entire settlement was changing around them. What had appeared preserved and intact moments before was now showing its true age: rotting wood, collapsed roofs, broken windows. And from every building, from every crack in the ground, came more voices. Hundreds of them. The voices of everyone who had ever come to Pine Hollow and never left. Miners from the 1800s, lost hikers from the 1950s, curious teenagers from the 1980s, all speaking at once, all telling the same story of descent and entrapment and eternal wandering in the tunnels beneath the town. "The mine entrance," Finn shouted, pointing to a hillside where a dark opening yawned like a mouth. "That's where they all went down." But even as he pointed, they could see lights moving in that tunnel. Dozens of lanterns held by figures they couldn't quite make out, figures that might have been people or might have been something else entirely. The ground beneath Pine Hollow was alive with activity, a vast network of tunnels filled with the lost and the trapped, all calling out to anyone who might hear, all trying to warn and welcome at the same time. And then, from directly beneath their feet, came four familiar voices speaking in perfect unison. "Don't go into the tunnels. Please, don't make the same mistake we did. The way down is easy, but there is no way back up. We've been walking these tunnels for... how long has it been? Days? Years? Time doesn't work the same way down here. The walls move when you're not looking. The passages change. And the things that live in the deeper tunnels, they're not human anymore. They used to be. But the darkness changed them, made them hungry for company, hungry for new voices to add to the collection." The four hikers above ground stared at each other in absolute horror as their own voices continued the warning from below. "We thought we could explore just the entrance, just a few feet inside to see what the old mine looked like. But the tunnel curved, and when we tried to go back, the entrance wasn't there anymore. We've been walking ever since, following the voices of all the others who came before us, adding our voices to theirs, becoming part of Pine Hollow forever." The underground Dakota's voice took on a tone of desperate urgency. "Run. Run now while you still can. Don't let curiosity kill you like it killed us. Don't become another voice in the collection." But as the four living hikers turned to flee Pine Hollow, they found their path blocked. The forest around the settlement had changed, the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining to form an impenetrable wall. Every direction they tried led them in a circle, always bringing them back to the main street of the ghost town. And with each failed escape attempt, the voices below grew more excited, more welcoming, as if they knew what was inevitable. "Welcome to Pine Hollow," called a voice that might have been a miner from 1887. "Don't fight it. The sooner you come down, the sooner the loneliness ends. There's room for everyone in the tunnels," added what sounded like a young woman from the 1960s. Time to join the collection. The four hikers huddled together in the middle of the street as darkness began to fall, though they hadn't noticed the sun setting. The lantern lights in the mine entrance grew brighter, more inviting, and they could hear their underground selves calling out one final warning. Whatever you do, don't listen to the welcoming voices. Don't go into the mine. Because once you're down there, once you become part of the collection, you'll spend eternity trying to warn others while simultaneously calling them down to join you. The curse of Pine Hollow isn't just being trapped, it's being forced to perpetuate the trap forever. But as the cold night air settled around them and strange sounds began to echo from the surrounding forest, the four hikers realized they had only two choices: spend the night above ground with whatever creatures roamed the Pine Hollow wilderness in the darkness, or seek shelter in the only building that looked safe and warm, the mine entrance, glowing with welcoming lantern light and filled with the voices of people who promised they were no longer alone. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. One by one, they began walking toward the mine entrance, their flashlights growing dim as they approached the tunnel mouth, their own voices already beginning to echo from somewhere deep below, welcoming the next group of hikers who would inevitably find their way to Pine Hollow. Because some places are not meant to be found, some places are meant to find you. The screaming started at exactly 3:17 a.m. Rebecca Morrison jolted awake in the unfamiliar bed, her heart hammering against her ribcage like a caged animal desperate to escape. The sound had torn through her dreams like a rusty blade through silk, raw, primal, and utterly inhuman. She lay frozen, listening to the deafening silence that followed, more terrifying than the scream itself. "David," she whispered into the darkness, reaching across the cold sheets. Empty. The bed beside her was stone cold, as if no one had ever slept there at all. The booking confirmation had seemed too good to be true. Cabin 13 on Blackstone Ridge, a luxury mountain retreat nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, available for an entire week at a fraction of the usual price. The photos showed a pristine log cabin with panoramic mountain views, a stone fireplace, and all the modern amenities a family could want for their summer vacation. But the cabin they'd arrived at yesterday felt wrong from the moment they'd stepped inside. Rebecca fumbled for the bedside lamp, her fingers trembling as they found the switch. Click. Nothing. The electricity had been working perfectly when they'd gone to bed. She tried again, pressing harder. Still nothing. "Kids," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oliver, Charlotte." Silence. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned as she stood, each step echoing through the cabin like gunshots in a cathedral. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on her lungs. Through the bedroom window, she could see the first pale hints of dawn creeping across the sky, but something was terribly wrong with the view. Yesterday, the cabin had overlooked a pristine valley dotted with pine trees and a crystal-clear lake. Now, all she could see was an endless expanse of black water stretching to the horizon, its surface as still as death itself. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. This was impossible. Lakes didn't just appear overnight. Mountains didn't simply vanish. She crept toward the bedroom door, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get her family, and flee this place immediately. But where could they go? The winding mountain road they'd taken to reach the cabin had been treacherous enough in daylight. In the pre-dawn darkness, with no working headlights, she noticed their car's battery was mysteriously dead when David had tried to move it to the covered parking area. They'd be trapped. The hallway stretched before her like a throat waiting to swallow her whole. Family photos lined the walls, but these weren't their photos. The faces staring back at her were strangers, people she'd never seen before, their eyes seeming to track her movement as she passed. In one frame, a man who looked remarkably like David stood beside a woman who could have been Rebecca's twin, their arms wrapped around two children who bore an uncanny resemblance to Oliver and Charlotte. But their eyes were wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Black as coal, empty as graves. "David," she called again, louder this time. Her voice seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves. dying before it could travel more than a few feet. The living room was exactly as they'd left it the night before, and completely different. The furniture was the same, positioned identically, but the wood looked older, weathered by decades instead of the pristine condition it had been in yesterday. The stone fireplace held the cold ashes of a fire that had burned out long ago, though she was certain they'd extinguished the flames completely before retiring for the night. On the mantelpiece, a guest book lay open. Rebecca approached it with growing dread, her bare feet silent on the suddenly ice-cold wooden floor. The pages were filled with entries dating back decades, each one praising the wonderful stay at Cabin 13, each one signed by families who had apparently visited this exact same cabin. But as she read the entries more carefully, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The Johnsons, September 1987. Lovely stay, though we could have sworn we booked for only 3 days. Somehow it became a full week. Time flies when you're having fun. The Rodriguez family, June 1993. Strange how our car wouldn't start when we tried to leave early. Ended up staying the full month. The kids loved every minute. The Patterson clan, August 2001. Funny thing, we came here for our summer vacation, but when we finally left, it was Christmas. Must have been having too much fun to notice the time passing. Rebecca's hand shook as she flipped through page after page of similar entries. Families arriving for weekend getaways and somehow staying for weeks, months, even years without realizing it. And at the bottom of every single entry, the same addendum in faded red ink. They never really left. A crash from upstairs sent her spinning around, her heart nearly stopping. It had come from the children's room. "Oliver! Charlotte!" she screamed, abandoning all pretense of quiet as she raced up the stairs 2 at a time. The steps seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each one higher than the last, as if the cabin itself was growing around her. The children's bedroom door stood ajar, creaking softly on its hinges. Inside, she could hear whispers, soft, urgent voices that sounded almost like her children, but not quite right. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, harsh consonants and flowing vowels that seemed to scrape against her eardrums. She pushed the door open. The room was empty. The twin beds where Oliver and Charlotte had slept were neatly made, as if no one had ever used them. But on the dresser mirror, written in what looked suspiciously like condensed breath, were the words, "Welcome home, family." Rebecca spun around, expecting to find someone behind her, but the hallway was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, new words were appearing as she watched. "You've been here before. We've been waiting." Time to remember. The temperature in the room plummeted. Rebecca's breath began to fog as she backed toward the door, but her reflection in the mirror didn't move with her. Instead, her mirror self smiled a cold, knowing smile and mouthed words that made Rebecca's soul shrivel. "You can't leave. None of us can leave." She turned and ran, down the endless staircase, through the living room where the furniture now looked centuries old, past windows that showed not the familiar Colorado mountains, but an alien landscape under a blood-red sky. The front door seemed miles away, but she finally reached it, her lungs burning as she grasped the handle and pulled. Locked, not just locked, sealed, as if the door had been painted shut for decades. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, accompanied by voices she recognized but wished she didn't. Rebecca. David's voice, but wrong somehow. Too hollow, too empty. "Where are you going, honey? We just got here." "Mom." Charlotte's voice, sweet and innocent and terrifying. "We were having such a nice dream. Why did you wake us up?" "Don't you remember, Mom?" Oliver's voice, older somehow than it had been yesterday. "We've been coming here every summer for years. This is our home now." Rebecca pressed her back against the door, tears streaming down her face as 3 familiar figures descended the stairs. They looked like her family, David's kind eyes and gentle smile, Charlotte's curly blonde hair, Oliver's gap-toothed grin, but something fundamental was missing from each of them. They moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes, their eyes reflecting the pale morning light like mirrors. "We belong here," David said, reaching out to her with hands that were just slightly too long, fingers that bent in ways human fingers shouldn't. "We've always belonged here. Don't you remember signing the guest book?" Rebecca looked down at her right hand. There, in fading black ink, was her own signature in the guest book entry for today's date. But she didn't remember signing it. She would never forget signing something so important. Would she? "The Hendersons," she whispered, reading the name written above her signature. "Were the Hendersons." But that wasn't right. Their name was Morrison. Rebecca Morrison, David Morrison, Oliver and Charlotte Morrison. They lived in a suburban house in Denver. David worked as an accountant. She taught elementary school. The kids were starting 3rd and 5th grade in the fall, weren't they? The memories felt fuzzy now, like trying to remember a dream after waking. Had they always been the Hendersons? Had they been coming to Cabin 13 for years, decades even? She looked at David, sweet, familiar David, and tried to remember their wedding day. The image that came to mind was of them standing before the stone fireplace in this very cabin, exchanging vows while an audience of previous guests looked on with their black, empty eyes. "That's right," Charlotte said, her voice echoing strangely in the room. "We've been so happy here. Haven't we, Mommy?" "So very happy," Oliver agreed. "Time doesn't matter when you're with family." Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to hold onto the fragments of her real life, her real identity. But they were slipping away like water through her fingers. The harder she tried to grasp them, the faster they disappeared. When she opened her eyes again, the cabin looked different. Warm, welcoming, filled with the golden light of a perfect summer morning. Through the windows, she could see the beautiful mountain vista they'd fallen in love with when they'd first discovered this place. The lake sparkled like diamonds in the distance, just as it always had. "There's my beautiful wife," David said, wrapping his arms around her. His embrace felt warm and real and right. "You looked so confused for a moment. Bad dream." Rebecca looked up into his eyes, brown, kind, completely normal, and smiled. "Just a silly nightmare. Something about us being trapped here forever." David laughed, the sound rich and familiar. "Trapped? In paradise? We're the lucky ones, Rebecca. We found our perfect place." "Our forever home," Charlotte added, appearing at her mother's side to hug her tight. "Where every day is exactly the same," Oliver said, grinning as he joined the family embrace. "Perfect and peaceful and exactly the same." Rebecca felt a final flicker of unease, a tiny voice in the back of her mind screaming that something was wrong, that this wasn't real, that they needed to run before it was too late. But the feeling faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a warm sense of contentment. Outside, new guests were pulling up the long driveway in a rented SUV. A family of 4, looking tired from their long drive, but excited for their mountain vacation. The reservation confirmation in their hands clearly showed they'd booked cabin 12, but the number on the door they'd stop in front of would read 13. It always did. Rebecca watched from the window as the new family unpacked their bags, chattering excitedly about their week-long getaway. She smiled and waved when the mother looked up and saw her. Soon, they'd be one big, happy family, just like all the others who'd found their way to Blackstone Ridge, just like all the others who discovered that some vacations never really end. The guest book lay open on the mantelpiece, ready for fresh signatures, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the mountain wind, came the sound of screaming. It was exactly 3:17 a.m. It was always 3:17 a.m., and it always would be. The GPS signal died exactly at 4:20 a.m. Jessica Morrison had been hiking for 6 days through the remote wilderness of British Columbia, her compass spinning wildly in directions that defied all logic. What started as a simple solo trek through Whistler's backcountry had become something far more sinister. The trail markers she'd been following religiously for the past 2 days seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She stopped, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid mountain air. Something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong. The same dead pine tree stood before her again, the one with the peculiar lightning scar that resembled a screaming face. She had passed this exact spot 4 times in the last 3 hours, despite taking completely different paths each time. Each loop brought her back here, to this cursed landmark, and with each return, the forest grew darker. Not darker in the natural way of approaching nightfall. This was something else entirely. The shadows between the trees seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, reaching toward her with fingers of absolute black. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since her first encounter with the scarred pine, and now frost was forming on her pack, despite the GPS reading September 15th. Jessica's hands trembled as she checked her phone again. No signal. The battery showed 97%, but the screen flickered with static every few seconds, displaying impossible readings, coordinates that placed her simultaneously in Canada, Australia, and somewhere called the void between. A twig snapped behind her. She spun around, her headlamp cutting through the supernatural gloom. Nothing, but the sound had been deliberate, calculated, not the random crack of settling wood or scurrying wildlife. Someone, or something, had stepped on that branch with purpose. Hello, her voice echoed strangely, as if the forest was swallowing the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. Is someone there? The silence that followed was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. Even her own breathing seemed muted, as though the air itself had thickened into something that resisted sound. Jessica had been an experienced hiker for 12 years. She traversed the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Trail, and countless European Alps routes. She knew forest sounds, understood wilderness behavior, could read weather patterns like a book. But this place followed no natural laws she recognized. She pulled out her paper map, the old-fashioned backup her grandfather had taught her to always carry. The topographical lines seemed to shift as she watched, rearranging themselves into impossible configurations. Elevation markers changed numbers. Trail symbols appeared and disappeared like mirages. The dead pine tree grown behind her, a sound that went on far too long and resonated with harmonics that hurt her teeth. Jessica forced herself to breathe steadily and think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Maybe she was experiencing altitude sickness, though they were barely at 4,000 feet. Perhaps dehydration was causing hallucinations, though she'd been drinking regularly from her purified water supply. She chose a trail heading due east, opposite from every previous attempt. This time, she would mark her path with ribbons from her first aid kit, creating an undeniable record of her route. The first orange strip went around a birch tree with distinctive white bark. She tied it tight, then continued forward with determined strides. 20 minutes later, she found her orange ribbon on the same birch tree, approaching from the same direction. Her hands shook as she examined the knot. It was identical to the one she tied, down to the specific way she always twisted the fabric. But that was impossible. She had walked in a straight line, never deviating, never turning around. Her compass had pointed east the entire time. The forest laughed, not metaphorically. The trees around her produced a sound like human laughter, dozens of voices chuckling in perfect, horrible harmony. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off bark and leaves that had no business making such noises. Jessica ran. She crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, and sprinted down what looked like a clear path toward distant light. Her pack bounced against her back, equipment rattling with each desperate step. Branches clawed at her jacket, and roots seemed to rise up specifically to trip her, but she kept moving. The light ahead grew brighter. A clearing. Safety. Escape. She burst through the final wall of vegetation and skidded to a halt in a small meadow. Moonlight streamed down through an opening in the canopy, illuminating grass that looked silver in the ethereal glow. At the center of the clearing stood a weathered wooden sign. Jessica approached on trembling legs and read the faded text. Whitefall Trail, EST 1952. In memory of those who walked the endless path. Coordinates: 52.1326 degrees north, 125.3025 degrees west. Below the main text, carved in fresher wood, were names. Thomas Hartwell, UK. September 2019. Disappeared loop, 23-inch. Claire Dubois, France, July 2020. Disappeared loop 31-inch. William Koch, Germany, May 2021. Disappeared loop 18-inch. Alexandra Petrov, Australia, August 2022. Disappeared loop 45-inch. The list continued downward, names from across the world, each with their country of origin and a loop number. The wood was fresh enough that she could still smell sawdust. Someone had been carving new names very recently. At the bottom, in letters that seemed to glow with their own pale light. Jessica Morrison, Canada, September 2023. Current loop, 5-inch. Her blood turned to ice water. The carving was perfect, exactly matching her full name, nationality, and today's date. But the loop number was wrong. She had only circled back to the dead pine 4 times. A rustle came from the forest edge. Jessica spun toward the sound and saw a figure emerging from between the trees. Tall, gaunt, wearing hiking gear from what looked like decades past. The man's face was pale as bone, his eyes reflecting light like an animal's. When he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too numerous. "Welcome to Whitefall Trail," he said in an accent she couldn't place. Something European, but wrong, as if filtered through centuries of isolation. "I'm Thomas Hartwell. I've been waiting for you." "That's impossible," Jessica whispered. "You disappeared in 2019. "Did I?" Thomas tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "Time works differently here. Loop 23 was yesterday for me. Or perhaps it was decades ago. The forest doesn't follow your calendar." Jessica Morrison of Canada. More figures emerged from the treeline. A woman with short blonde hair and a German accent spoke next. "William Koch, disappeared May 2021. Though I've been walking these paths since 1943. The forest collects us, you see. Adds us to its collection." "Claire Dubois," said another, her French pronunciation flawless, despite the otherworldly echo to her voice. "I've been here for 3 years or 3 minutes, depending on how you count loops. The trail decides when you've walked enough circles to join us permanently." Alexandra Petrov. Came an Australian accent from the shadows. "The forest liked my loop number. 45 was quite impressive, according to the rules, though I never learned what those rules actually were." Jessica backed toward the center of the clearing, surrounded now by dozens of hikers from different decades, different countries, all wearing the same expression of resigned hunger. Their eyes reflected the moonlight like mirrors, and when they breathed, frost came out despite the temperature being impossibly warm and cold simultaneously. "What do you want?" she managed to ask. "Want?" Thomas laughed, the sound echoing strangely. "We don't want anything anymore. The forest does the wanting now. It wants you to keep walking, Jessica. To keep looping. Each circle makes you more a part of this place, and less a part of wherever you came from." "But I can leave," Jessica said desperately. "I can find the main trail, get back to civilization." "Can you?" Claire interrupted. "Check your supplies." Jessica looked down at her pack. The water bottles were empty, though she remembered them being full minutes ago. Her food supplies had vanished entirely. The fabric of her jacket was fraying at the edges, as if aged by decades of wear. "Loop 5, William said thoughtfully. "Still early. You have time before the final change. Some of us made it to Loop 30 before we couldn't leave anymore. Others joined us at Loop 8. The forest decides based on criteria we never quite understood." "The dead pine tree," Alexandra added. "That's your anchor point. Every loop brings you back there, and every return changes you a little more. By Loop 10, you'll start seeing us even when we're not visible. By Loop 20, you'll understand the forest's language. By Loop 30, you become part of the collection," Thomas finished. "Forever walking, forever looping, forever adding your steps to the endless path." Jessica felt something change inside her chest, a loosening, as if her connection to the outside world was becoming tenuous. The faces of her family seemed harder to remember. Her apartment in Vancouver felt like a dream from someone else's life. "No," she said firmly. "I'm leaving. Right now." She turned and ran toward what looked like the trail exit, but the forest seemed to stretch as she moved. The distance between her and the tree line increased with every step, until she was running in place, while the clearing expanded around her like a balloon inflating. Loop 6. The voices called behind her in unison. Beginning Loop 6. Jessica found herself standing next to the dead pine tree with the lightning scar. Her headlamp illuminated the familiar twisted bark. The screaming face burned into the wood by electricity and time. But now she could see something she'd missed before. Names carved into the trunk. Hundreds of them, in languages from around the world. At the bottom, fresh cuts spelled out. Loop 6. The anchor grows stronger. She tried to run again, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The forest around her had grown darker still, and she could see glowing eyes watching from between every tree. Not animal eyes, human eyes, belonging to faces that were no longer entirely human. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Frost began forming on her skin. Loop 7, whispered the wind through the branches. Loop 8. Loop 9. Jessica realized with growing horror that time was accelerating. She could feel herself moving through the forest paths at impossible speed, covering the same route over and over while something fundamental about her reality shifted with each completion. Her memories of the outside world grew fainter. Her name felt foreign in her own mind. By Loop 15, she understood the forest's language. By Loop 22, she could see the collection of lost hikers clearly. Dozens of people from every continent, every decade since the trail was established, all walking their eternal circuits through these cursed woods. By Loop 30, Jessica Morrison of Canada forgot why she had ever wanted to leave. She carved her final entry into the memorial sign with fingernails that had grown sharp and strong. Jessica Morrison, Canada, September 2023. Disappeared. Loop 30, joined the endless path. Then she took her place among the watchers, waiting for the next solo hiker to discover Whitefall Trail, waiting for the GPS signals to die, waiting for the compass to spin wildly, waiting for Loop 1 to begin again. The forest was always hungry, and the trail that loops back never ends. The screaming started at exactly 1:15 a.m. Jessica Harper jolted awake in her sleeping bag, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound had torn through the Canadian wilderness like a knife through silk, human, desperate, and impossibly close. She grabbed her flashlight with trembling fingers, the beam cutting through the suffocating darkness of their campsite. "Did you hear that?" whispered David Chun from the tent beside her, his British accent thick with terror. Around Camp Blackwood, 5 other campers were stirring. The weekend retreat for international graduate students had seemed like the perfect escape from their studies at McGill University. Now, as the echo of that inhuman wail faded into the tree line, Jessica wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. "That wasn't an animal," said Klaus Mueller, the German exchange student, emerging from his tent with wide eyes. "That was someone calling for help." The group gathered around the dying embers of their campfire, faces pale in the flickering light. There was Jessica from Texas, David from London, Klaus from Berlin, Francesca from Rome, Henrik from Stockholm, and twin brothers Jake and Connor from Melbourne. 7 friends who'd bonded over late-night study sessions and cheap coffee. 7 friends who were all accounted for. "Maybe it's another camping group?" Francesca suggested, her Italian accent barely masking her fear. "Someone could be lost." Henrik shook his head, scanning the impenetrable wall of pine trees that surrounded them. "We hiked 8 hours to get here. The rangers said we'd be the only ones for miles." Another scream pierced the night, closer this time, definitely closer. It came from the northern tree line, where ancient spruces stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky. The sound was wrong somehow, stretched and hollow, as if the very forest was in agony. "We have to help," David said, grabbing his backpack. "If someone's hurt." "No." Klaus's voice was sharp. "Something's not right about this. That scream, it didn't sound completely human." Jake laughed nervously, running a hand through his sandy hair. "Come on, mate. What else could it be?" His twin Connor wasn't laughing. He was staring at the tree line with an expression of growing horror. "Guys," he whispered, "look at the trees." They followed his gaze and felt their blood turn to ice water. The trees along the northern edge were moving, not swaying in the wind, but shifting positions, sliding silently through the earth like massive, slow-motion dancers. Branches that had been there moments before were gone. Gaps in the tree line had closed. That's impossible," Francesca breathed. The screaming came again, but this time it was different. Instead of one voice, there were multiple voices, calling out in a haunting chorus. Jessica recognized one of them with a jolt of pure terror. It was her own voice. "Help us," her voice called from the trees. "Please, we're lost. We can't find our way back." But Jessica was standing right there, her mouth clamped shut in horror. The others heard it too, their own voices echoing back at them from the darkness, pleading, desperate, afraid. "Jessica, where are you?" David's voice called from the woods, though David stood frozen beside the campfire. "I'm scared," cried Klaus's voice from somewhere beyond the tree line. "Don't leave me here." Henrik grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the forest edge. For just a moment, the beam caught something that made him drop the light with a crash. Standing between the trees, barely visible in the shadows, were figures. 7 figures that looked exactly like them, but wrong somehow. Their movements too fluid, their eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. "We need to leave," Connor said, his voice cracking. "Right now. Pack everything and go." But as they turned toward their cars parked on the dirt road behind them, they found their path blocked. The tree line had moved again, somehow extending across the road. Ancient pines now stood where open space had been just minutes before. "That's not possible," Henrik whispered. "Trees don't just move." The voices from the forest grew louder, more insistent. Now they could hear conversations, fragments of discussions they'd had earlier that day, jokes they'd shared, private confessions they'd made to each other. But the voices were coming from the wrong mouths, mixing and overlapping in ways that shouldn't exist. "I saw something in those trees today," Jake's voice echoed from the forest, though Jake had never said those words. "Something watching us. The locals warned us about this place," Francesca's voice added from the darkness, though she'd never spoken to any locals. Jessica felt reality beginning to crack around the edges. "What do they want?" she whispered. Her question was answered by her own voice, calling back from the trees. "We want to go home. We want to be with our families. We want to be you." David grabbed the car keys from his pocket. The trees moved, but maybe we could drive through them. Maybe they're not really. A hand fell on his shoulder. He spun around to find himself face to face with himself, another David, identical in every way except for the eyes. They were completely black, like looking into a deep well at midnight. "You can't leave," the other David said in David's own voice. "It's our turn now. We've been waiting so long." All around the campsite, the duplicates emerged from the tree line. 7 perfect copies, each one matching their originals exactly except for those terrible, empty eyes. They moved with unnatural grace, as if they were floating slightly above the ground. "What are you?" Klaus demanded, backing away from his own doppelganger. "We are the Forgotten," Klaus's double replied. "The ones who came before. Campers, hikers, hunters, all drawn to this place, all replaced. We take your forms, your memories, your lives, and you join us in the trees, calling out to the next group, helping us hunt." The original campers huddled together, backs to the dying fire. Around them, the duplicates circled like wolves, studying their prey with scientific interest. "Your friends and family will never know," Jessica's double said with Jessica's own smile. "We'll return to your lives, finish your degrees, marry your partners, raise your children. We'll be better than you ever were." "But what about us?" Francesca cried. Her double tilted its head with mock sympathy. "You'll stay here, in the trees, forever, calling out to the next visitors, helping us bring them close enough to replace. It's not so bad. You'll have each other, for eternity." Henrik made a desperate lunge for the car, but the trees had grown closer, their branches now intertwining above the vehicle like a living cage. The duplicates didn't even try to stop him. They knew there was nowhere to run. "The transformation is almost complete," David's double announced. "Look." The originals looked down at their hands and screamed. Their fingers were becoming translucent, like shadows cast by moonlight. They could see through their own skin to the ground beneath their feet. "No, no, no," Jake moaned, watching his body fade. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." But it was real. As their physical forms dissolved, they felt themselves being pulled toward the trees, drawn into the ancient wood like smoke into a chimney. Their thoughts became confused. Their memories began to mix with those of the ones who had come before, dozens of previous visitors, all absorbed into the forest's hungry embrace. The duplicates stood and stretched, flexing their newly solid bodies. They practiced smiles, tested voices, adjusted postures to match their originals perfectly. Within minutes, they were indistinguishable from the people they had replaced. The new David picked up the car keys. "We should head back. Big exam on Monday." "Right," agreed the new Jessica, extinguishing the campfire. "Thanks for the great weekend, everyone. Same time next year." They laughed and chatted as they loaded their gear, perfect mimics of friendship and normalcy. As their headlights swept across the treeline, illuminating nothing but innocent-looking pines, they could have been any group of students heading home from a camping trip. Behind them, deeper in the forest, 7 new voices joined the eternal chorus, calling out to the next visitors, hungry for company, desperate to share their fate. The screaming would start again soon. After all, hunting season never really ends at Camp Blackwood. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the night wind, came the sound of another car approaching down the dirt road. The radio crackled with static as Detective James Morrison adjusted the frequency for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His partner, Officer Rebecca Walsh, gripped the steering wheel tighter as their patrol car wound through the narrow mountain road leading to Cold Hollow. The fog rolled in thick waves across their windshield, and the headlights seemed to barely penetrate the suffocating darkness ahead. "Control, this is Unit 7. We're approaching the last known location of the missing hikers. Visibility is near zero," Morrison spoke into the radio, his voice carrying an edge of unease. Static answered him. "When was the last confirmed sighting?" Walsh asked, her Irish accent more pronounced when she was nervous. Morrison flipped through his notepad. 3 days ago. A group of 5 campers from Toronto, the Henderson family and their friends. Park ranger found their abandoned campsite yesterday morning. Tents still set up, food still warm on the camp stove, but no sign of them anywhere. Walsh's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "That makes it 14 people in 2 months, James. 14 people who just vanished." The radio suddenly burst to life with a piercing shriek of feedback before cutting to dead silence. Both officers jumped, and Walsh nearly swerved off the narrow road. "Jesus Christ," Morrison muttered, adjusting the radio again. Nothing but static filled the car. As they rounded another bend, the headlights caught something that made Walsh slam on the brakes. There, about 50 yards ahead, a faint yellow light flickered between the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, swaying back and forth like someone carrying a lantern. "You see that?" Morrison whispered, though he didn't know why he was whispering. Walsh nodded, unable to speak. The light was hypnotic, beautiful even, cutting through the fog like a beacon of hope. It seemed to be moving deeper into the woods, away from the road. "We should follow it," Morrison said suddenly, his hand already on the door handle. "Someone might need help." "James, no. Something's not right about this." Walsh's training told her to call for backup, to wait, to think. But the light was so beautiful, so warm and inviting in the cold October night. Morrison was already out of the car, his flashlight beams seeming pathetic compared to the golden glow ahead. "Come on, Rebecca. We can't just sit here. People are missing." Against every instinct screaming in her head, Walsh turned off the engine and followed her partner into the woods. The light always seemed to be just ahead of them, never getting closer despite their steady pace. The trees grew denser as they walked, their branches forming a canopy so thick that Morrison's flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness above. The fog moved strangely here, not rolling naturally but swirling in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "James," Walsh called out, but her voice sounded muffled, distant. She realized with growing horror that she could no longer see her partner, though she could hear his footsteps somewhere ahead. "Keep following the light." His voice drifted back to her, but it sounded different somehow. Hollow. "It's beautiful, isn't it, Rebecca? So warm, so welcoming." The lantern light pulsed brighter, and Walsh found herself walking faster, pushing through brambles that tore at her uniform. Her radio crackled occasionally, but the voices coming through were speaking in languages she didn't recognize, German, perhaps, or Dutch. "Control, can you Mandhilf?" The voice was panicked, desperate. "Morrison, are you hearing this?" But there was no answer from her partner. The light stopped moving. Walsh stopped too, suddenly aware that the forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no wind, no sound at all except her own ragged breathing. The lantern hung motionless in the air about 20 feet ahead, casting its warm glow on something that made her blood turn to ice. A figure stood beside the light, tall and impossibly thin, dressed in clothes that might have been from another century. Its face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see its hands, pale, skeletal fingers wrapped around the handle of an old-fashioned oil lantern. "Welcome," the figure spoke, and its voice was the sound of wind through empty houses, of footsteps in abandoned halls. "I have been waiting so long for visitors." Walsh tried to run, tried to scream, tried to reach for her weapon, but her body wouldn't obey. The light was so beautiful, so warm, and she found herself walking toward it despite every rational thought telling her to flee. "Your partner is here," the lantern keeper continued, gesturing with one skeletal hand toward the darkness behind him. "The German hikers from last week, the Australian couple from September, the family from London, they're all here, safe in the light." As Walsh drew closer, she could see them, dozens of figures standing motionless in a circle around the lantern. Men, women, children, all with the same vacant stare, all bathed in that horrible, beautiful glow. She recognized some faces from missing person reports. Morrison stood among them, his eyes reflecting the lantern light like a cat's. "Don't be afraid," the keeper whispered. "The light will keep you warm forever. No more cold nights, no more fear, no more loneliness, just the eternal glow of my lantern." Walsh felt her mind slipping away as the warmth enveloped her. She thought of her family in Cork, of her mother who would wonder why she never called, of the wedding she would never have with her fiancé David. But these thoughts seemed distant now, unimportant compared to the beautiful light. The keeper raised his lantern higher, and the glow intensified. "Cold Hollow has been my home for 2 centuries, he said, his voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "I died here in the winter of 1823, froze to death while trying to guide lost travelers to safety. But the darkness took me, gave me purpose. Now I guide others to warmth, eternal warmth." Walsh felt herself becoming part of the circle, felt her will dissolving into the collective consciousness of the lost. But somewhere deep in her mind, a small voice was screaming, fighting against the beautiful prison of light. With tremendous effort, she reached for her radio one final time. Her fingers, moving as if through thick honey, managed to press the emergency broadcast button. "This is Officer Walsh. Cold Hollow. Don't follow the light, don't." Her voice was fading, becoming part of the collective whisper of the keeper's victims. The transmission cut to static. 3 days later, a search team found their patrol car abandoned on the mountain road. Both officers' equipment was accounted for, but James Morrison and Rebecca Walsh were nowhere to be found. The only clue was a final radio transmission, a woman's voice, barely audible through the static, warning others not to follow something called the light. Park officials closed Cold Hollow to the public indefinitely, but on foggy October nights, when the temperature drops and the mist rolls through the mountains, locals still report seeing a faint yellow glow moving through the trees. They know better than to investigate. The lantern keeper is still waiting, still gathering lost souls for his eternal congregation of light. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind on those cold, dark nights, you can hear the voices of his collection, dozens of people from around the world, speaking in whispered unison. Come to the light. Come to the warmth. Come home. The radio in the abandoned patrol car still crackles with static on certain nights, broadcasting the same message in different languages: English, German, French, Italian, Spanish. The voices of the lost trying to warn others, even as they beckon them forward into the beautiful, terrible glow of the Lantern Keeper's eternal vigil. Cold Hollow remains closed, but the light still burns, and it's still waiting. The radio crackled with static as Ranger Jackson Clark climbed the final steps to Fire Watchtower 7. His boots echoed against the metal grating, each step reverberating through the towering structure that pierced the Canadian wilderness like a skeletal finger. The October wind howled through the framework, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that made his skin crawl. Base, this is Clark. I've reached Tower 7, beginning my seasonal occupation now. He spoke into his radio, but only static answered back. The door to the cabin creaked open with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows. Everything looked exactly as it should. Maps pinned to walls, weather instruments arranged on the desk, emergency supplies stocked in corners. But something felt wrong. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. Jackson frowned. The previous ranger, Oliver Hartmann, should have taken all personal belongings when his season ended. He opened the journal to the first page. Day 1, April 15th. My name is Oliver Hartmann. I've been assigned to Tower 7 for the fire season. Strange thing, though. I could swear I've been here before. The dreams feel so real. Jackson flipped through more pages. The entries continued through spring, summer, and into fall. But that was impossible. Oliver's season should have ended in September, and Jackson had been specifically told the tower had been empty for weeks. Day 156, September 18th. I tried to leave today. Packed everything, called for pickup. But when I got to the bottom of the tower, I found myself back at the top. The radio won't work. My truck is gone. I'm starting to think I never actually came here to begin with. A chill ran down Jackson's spine. He checked the date on his watch, October 3rd. According to the journal, Oliver had been writing entries well into late September. Day 173, October 3rd. Someone new is coming today. I can feel it. I've been watching the access road through my binoculars. A truck, Forest Service plates. I want to warn him, but I don't think he'll be able to see me. Not anymore. Not since I figured out the truth about Tower 7. Jackson's hands trembled as he read his own arrival described in perfect detail. The journal entry was dated today. His name is Jackson Clark. He's from Vancouver originally, but transferred from the Rockies. Lost his wife in a car accident 2 years ago. That's why he requested the most isolated posting available. He thinks being alone will help him heal. He has no idea what alone really means up here. Asterisk. Jackson slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding. How could Oliver know about Rebecca? He'd never told anyone at the Forest Service about the accident, about why he'd requested this remote assignment. The radio suddenly burst to life. Tower 7, this is Base. Jackson, are you there? Jackson grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. Base, this is Tower 7. I need immediate extraction. There's something wrong here. The transmission cut to static. Then, impossibly, his own voice came through the speaker. Base, this is Clark. I've reached Tower 7, beginning my seasonal occupation now. Jackson stared at the radio in horror. That was exactly what he'd said an hour ago. He tried the radio again, but now only silence answered. As darkness fell, Jackson noticed lights in the forest below, campfires arranged in a perfect circle around the base of the tower. Through his binoculars, he could see figures moving between the flames. Human shapes, but something was wrong with the way they moved. Too jerky, too unnatural. He opened the journal again, his hands shaking. Day 1, October 4th. My name is Jackson Clark. I've been assigned to Tower 7 for the fire season. Strange thing, though. I could swear I've been here before. The dreams feel so real. But Jackson hadn't written those words. The handwriting was his own, but he had no memory of picking up the pen. Day 2, October 5th. I found Oliver's journal today. At least, I think it's Oliver's. The handwriting keeps changing. Sometimes it looks like mine. I'm starting to understand what happened to him. What's happening to me? The fires below aren't campfires. They're bonfires. I can see them clearly now through the binoculars. Stacks of white, gleaming bones. Each pile burning with blue flames that never consumed the fuel. And the figures dancing around them. I recognize some of the faces. There's James Morrison, who was stationed here in 1987. Disappeared during a thunderstorm, they said. And Catherine Wells from 1994. Listed as a suicide, but now I know better. And Oliver Hartman, still wearing his ranger uniform, his face pale as moonlight. They're all the rangers who came before. All the ones who thought they could handle the isolation. All the ones who discovered too late that Tower 7 isn't just watching the forest, it's feeding on it. Jackson tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He looked down and saw roots, thick, gnarled tree roots, growing through the floorboards and wrapping around his ankles. The entire tower was alive, and it was hungry. Day 30, November 2nd. I understand now. Tower 7 isn't built on the forest. It's built on the bones of an ancient tree, something that died here centuries ago, but never stopped growing. The indigenous peoples knew to avoid this place. They called it the hungry ground. The tree feeds on loneliness, on isolation, on the deep sadness that draws people to places like this. It takes our pain and transforms it into something else, something that keeps us here forever, watching over its domain. I can see the access road from my window. A truck is coming. Forest Service plates. The new ranger arrives tomorrow. His name is David Chen. He's from Toronto, lost his brother in Afghanistan, requested the most isolated posting available. I want to warn him, but I know I won't be able to. The tree won't let me. Instead, I'll leave this journal where he'll find it. Maybe he'll be smarter than I was. Maybe he'll run before it's too late. Maybe he'll break the cycle. But probably not. Jackson's hand moved across the page without his control, writing words he didn't want to write. Day 1, November 3rd. My name is David Chen. I've been assigned to Tower 7 for the fire season. Strange thing, though. I could swear I've been here before. The dreams feel so real. Through the window, Jackson could see his own reflection, but it was fading, becoming transparent. Soon he would join the others around the bonfires, dancing their eternal dance, waiting for the next lonely soul to climb the tower stairs. The radio crackled one final time. Tower 7, this is base. David, are you there? And from somewhere deep in his throat, using his voice but not his words, came the reply. Base, this is Chun. I've reached Tower 7, beginning my seasonal occupation now. The cycle continued. In the forest below, 37 bonfires burned through the night, tended by 37 rangers who had answered the call of the hungry ground. And high above them all, Tower 7 waited patiently for number 38 to arrive, because the dead forest was always watching, and it was always hungry. Author's note, based on reports of missing Forest Service personnel in remote regions of British Columbia. Tower 7 was officially decommissioned in 2019 after 17 unexplained disappearances over a 30-year period. The structure remains standing, though access to the area is now permanently restricted. The silence was wrong, dead wrong. Rebecca Thompson had been hiking these Canadian Rockies for 15 years, and she knew every sound the mountains should make. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant cry of eagles, the gentle rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But here, on the narrow trail leading to Widow's Peak, there was nothing. Not even the sound of her own breathing seemed to carry in the thick, unnatural fog that had descended without warning. She checked her GPS device for the third time in 10 minutes. The screen flickered, showing her position as a small blue, surrounded by void. No trail markers, no topographical lines, Just empty white space where the mountains should be mapped. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice swallowed immediately by the dense mist that pressed against her like wet cotton. Behind her, the hiking party of 6 had grown increasingly nervous. David Chun from Vancouver kept checking his phone, finding no signal bars. The Thompson twins, Jessica and Jennifer, from Yorkshire had stopped their usual chatter 20 minutes ago. Even their guide, a weathered man named Robert Mackenzie, who claimed to know these peaks like his own backyard, had gone quiet. "Rebecca." David's voice cut through the FOG, strangely muffled despite being only 10 feet away. "We should turn back. This doesn't feel right." She wanted to agree. Every instinct screamed that they should retreat to the base camp where their fourth member, Alexander Rodriguez from Madrid, had decided to wait with a mild ankle sprain. But something about the FOG, something was calling to her. "Just a little further," she found herself saying, though she couldn't remember deciding to speak. "The peak is close." That was when they heard the first footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from directly ahead on the trail, though the fog was so thick they couldn't see more than 3 feet in any direction. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the rocky ground. Robert Mackenzie held up his hand, signaling them to stop. His weathered face had gone pale. "In 30 years of guiding," he whispered, "I've never seen fog like this. It's not natural. It's not moving with the wind patterns." The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, Rebecca became aware of her own heartbeat, thundering so loudly she was certain the others could hear it. Then, from somewhere in the white void ahead of them, came a voice. "Help me." The voice was distant, echoing strangely in the FOG, but distinctly human. Female. Young. Desperate. "Someone's in trouble," Jessica Thompson said, taking a step forward. "We have to." "No." Robert's voice cracked like a whip. "No one goes toward that voice. That's the first rule of survival on Widow's Peak." "What are you talking about?" Jennifer demanded. "If someone needs help." 16 people have disappeared on this mountain in the last 5 years, Robert said, his eyes never leaving the wall of fog ahead. All of them experienced hikers. All of them last seen heading toward the peak. The locals, they have stories about this place. The voice came again, closer now. "Please, I'm hurt. I can't find the trail." David started to move forward, but Robert grabbed his arm. "That voice belongs to Catherine Morrison, university student from Edinburgh. Went missing here 3 months ago." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then David laughed nervously. "That's impossible. You can't know that from just." "Because I was part of the search team that looked for her," Robert said quietly. "And because I heard her voice in the fog the day we found her backpack, but never found her." The temperature around them seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Their breath began forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and the fog grew even thicker, if that was possible. It began to move now, swirling in patterns that made no sense, spiraling upward in impossible helixes. "We're leaving. Now," Rebecca decided. But when she turned around, the trail behind them had vanished. There was only more FOG, stretching endlessly in every direction. "Help me, please. I'm so cold." This time the voice was right beside them. Jennifer screamed and stumbled backward into her sister. David fumbled for his flashlight, but when he clicked it on, the beam seemed to travel only inches before being absorbed by the thick mist. "There," Jessica whispered, pointing into the FOG. "I can see something." Rebecca strained her eyes and saw it too. A shape moving in the mist. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall. Moving with a strange, jerky gait. "Catherine," David called out before Robert could stop him. "Catherine Morrison, we're here to help." The shape in the fog stopped moving. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then it began walking toward them, and as it grew closer, they could make out more details that made Rebecca's blood turn to ice. The figure was indeed human-shaped, but its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It wore hiking clothes similar to their own, but they were torn and stained with something dark. And its face, what they could see of its face through the swirling mist, was pale as moonlight, with dark hollows where the eyes should be. "That's not Kaffir Morrison," Robert whispered. "That's not anyone who's still alive." The apparition raised one translucent hand and pointed directly at Rebecca. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the fog with an unnatural resonance. "You shouldn't have come here. None of you should have come here. But now that you have." The thing that might once have been human smiled, revealing teeth like broken glass. "Now you can join us." More shapes began emerging from the fog around them, dozens of them, all with that same ethereal, wrong quality, all wearing the clothes of hikers and climbers from different eras. Some looked recent, their gear modern and familiar. Others wore the canvas and wool of decades past. "The disappeared," Robert breathed. "They're all here. They've all been here, trapped in the FOG." One of the newer apparitions stepped forward, and David gasped in recognition. "Oh God, that's Michael Porter. He went missing last summer. I saw his picture in the news." The ghost of Michael Porter nodded slowly. "The FOG came for me, just like it came for you. It comes when people climb too high, get too close to the peak. It feeds on the living, and what it can't consume immediately." He gestured to the crowd of spirits surrounding them. "It keeps. What do you want?" Rebecca demanded, though her voice shook with terror. "To go home," the first apparition replied. "We've been trapped here so long, bound to this place by the FOG. But if we can find others to take our place." The circle of ghosts began to close in. Rebecca noticed that wherever they stepped, the ground beneath their feet turned white with frost. The FOG grew even thicker, pressing against them like a living thing. "Run," Robert whispered. "When I say go, run in any direction. Don't stop, don't look back, and whatever you do, don't listen to their voices." "But which way?" Jennifer asked desperately. "We can't see anything." "It doesn't matter," Robert said, pulling a flare from his pack. "The FOG wants to keep us here, but it can't hold us if we refuse to give up. The mountain, the real mountain, it's still out there beyond this supernatural trap." He pulled the pin on the flare, and brilliant red light exploded around them. The apparitions shrieked and recoiled, their forms becoming even more translucent in the harsh illumination. For just a moment, the fog thinned enough for them to see fragments of the real trail. "Go!" They ran blindly through the mist, the ghostly voices pursuing them, growing more desperate and angry with each step. Rebecca could hear them calling her name, promising warmth and rest and an end to the terror. The voices of the dead were seductive, offering peace in exchange for surrender. But she kept running, following the fading red glow of Robert's flare, trusting that somewhere ahead lay the boundary of whatever supernatural force held dominion over Widow's Peak. The FOG began to thin. Real sunlight started to filter through, and gradually, impossibly, they found themselves back on the familiar trail, gasping and shaking but alive. Behind them, the fog remained, a perfect dome of white mist covering the upper reaches of the mountain like a cap. And from within that mist, they could still hear the voices calling, promising that they would return, that no one who had been touched by the fog on Widow's Peak was ever truly free of it. As they made their way back to base camp, Rebecca noticed something that made her blood run cold one final time. The FOG was following them. Not quickly, not obviously, but like a slow tide. It was creeping down the mountain, extending its reach 1 foot at a time. And she realized with growing horror, their escape might not have been an escape at all. It might have been exactly what the spirits wanted, a way to spread beyond the confines of Widow's Peak, a way to follow them home. The ancient map crackled as Dr. Victoria Blackwood spread it across the mahogany table in her dimly lit study. The parchment bore the faded ink of a cartographer who had vanished without a trace in 1847, leaving behind only cryptic warnings scrawled in the margins. The trough calls to those who listen, but listening is the first mistake. Thunder rolled across the Virginia mountains as Victoria traced her finger along the jagged line that marked the Devil's Trough. a ravine so deep and narrow that local Cherokee tribes had declared it cursed centuries before white settlers ever set foot in the Appalachians. The wind howled through her cabin shutters like something dying, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm itself was trying to warn her away from tomorrow's expedition. Her research team had been preparing for months. Professor James Whitmore from Oxford University brought his expertise in geological anomalies. Dr. Ingrid Larson, a renowned acoustic specialist from Stockholm, had traveled here specifically to investigate the unexplained sound phenomena reported by hikers. Dr. Cameron Mitchell from Toronto's Paranormal Research Institute carried equipment that could detect electromagnetic disturbances no conventional science could explain. And from Melbourne, cryptozoologist Dr. Rubichin had arrived with theories about creatures that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The stories about Devil's Trough stretched back generations. Native American oral histories spoke of voices that echoed from the depths, not quite human, not quite animal, but something caught between worlds. Early settlers reported hearing their own names called from within the ravine's black mouth, only to discover later that the voices belonged to people who had disappeared decades earlier. In 1923, a group of geologists from the University of Kentucky descended into the trough to map its depths. Only one emerged, babbling about walls that moved like living flesh and screams that came from the stone itself. He spent the rest of his life in an asylum, drawing the same symbol over and over, a spiral that seemed to twist deeper the longer you stared at it. The most recent incident had occurred just 3 months ago. Twin brothers from Manchester, hiking the Appalachian Trail, had decided to explore the unmarked ravine. Their GPS devices were found a week later, scattered along the rim like breadcrumbs, each one displaying the same impossible reading. Their location is 6,000 feet underground, in a space that, according to all geological surveys, didn't exist. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from James. "Weather's getting worse. Maybe we should postpone." She glanced at the window, where rain now struck the glass like bullets. But she had waited too long for this opportunity. Satellite imagery had revealed something new in the trough, a geometric pattern carved into the stone that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Something was changing down there, and she intended to document it before it changed again. At midnight, the storm reached its peak. Victoria was reviewing her equipment when she heard it, a sound that made her blood turn to ice water. Carried on the wind, almost lost in the thunder, came the unmistakable sound of screaming. Not human screaming, but something that had perhaps once been human and had been twisted into something else entirely. She grabbed her binoculars and peered through the rain toward the mountains. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark black and white, and for one terrible moment, she could see the Devil's Trough, a black scar cutting across the mountainside like a wound that refused to heal. And from that wound, even through the storm, she could see a faint, pulsing glow. Her satellite phone rang, startling her. Dr. Larson's voice was tight with fear. "Victoria, are you hearing this? My acoustic equipment is picking up subsonic frequencies from the direction of the trough. The patterns, they're not natural. They're structured like a language, but the decibel levels are impossible. Nothing biological could produce sounds this intense without destroying its own vocal cords." Before Victoria could respond, the line went dead. The storm hadn't knocked out the satellite connection. The phone simply stopped working, its screen displaying static that formed shapes that looked almost like faces. She tried calling the others, but each phone displayed the same impossible message. "Signal redirected to Devil's Trough. Coordinates unknown." Sleep was impossible. Victoria spent the night pacing her cabin, watching the strange glow pulse from the ravine like a massive, underground heartbeat. With each flash, the screaming grew louder, more desperate, as if whatever was trapped down there knew they were coming and was trying to warn them away, or lure them closer. At dawn, the storm broke with unnatural suddenness. The sky cleared to an ominous shade of yellow-gray, and the air felt thick and oppressive, like breathing through wet wool. Victoria's team arrived at the trailhead looking haggard. None of them had slept. All of them had heard the screaming. Dr. Mitchell's electromagnetic sensors were already going haywire. "The readings are off the charts," he said, his Canadian accent thick with exhaustion. "Whatever's down there is generating a magnetic field stronger than anything I've ever recorded. It's like the Earth itself is crying out." Dr. Chun unpacked her cameras with shaking hands. "I've studied unexplained phenomena on 3 continents," she said in her crisp Australian accent. "But this feels different. This feels hungry." They began their descent at exactly 9 a.m. The trail to Devil's Trough was overgrown and treacherous, as if the forest itself was trying to hide the path. Trees grew at impossible angles, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. The deeper they went, the more the landscape seemed to change around them. Dr. Larson stopped suddenly, holding up her hand for silence. "Listen," she whispered. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Even their own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. Then they heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heart beating somewhere far below their feet. With each beat, the ground trembled slightly, and dust trickled from the trees overhead. "We should turn back," Dr. Whitmore said, his British composure finally cracking. "This isn't natural. This isn't scientific." But Victoria pressed forward, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The map in her backpack felt warm against her spine, as if the ancient parchment was absorbing heat from some unknown source. And in the back of her mind, barely audible above her own thundering heartbeat, she could swear she heard a voice calling her name. They reached the rim of Devil's Trough at noon, when the sun should have been at its brightest. Instead, the ravine seemed to swallow light itself, creating a darkness so complete it felt solid. Their flashlight beams penetrated only a few feet before being absorbed by the oppressive blackness below. Dr. Chin dropped a flare into the depths. They watched it fall and fall and fall, its red glow growing smaller until it simply vanished, not because it had reached the bottom, but because the darkness had consumed it. "The depth readings are impossible," Dr. Mitchell said, staring at his instruments. "According to this, the ravine goes down at least 12,000 feet. That would put it well below sea level. Geologically, this can't exist." That's when they noticed the symbols carved into the rock face, fresh cuts that gleamed with an oily, black substance that seemed to move and shift when they weren't looking directly at it. The patterns matched the ones from Victoria's ancient map exactly, but these were new, as if something had been carving them from the inside. Dr. Larson set up her acoustic equipment and immediately recoiled. The sound levels down there they're beyond measurement. But it's not just noise. There are voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in languages I don't recognize. She played back a recording through her speakers, and the team listened in horror as a cacophony of whispers, screams, and something that might have been laughter echoed from the device. But underneath it all was something else. A voice speaking English, calling out GPS coordinates that didn't match any location on Earth. "We need to go down," Victoria said, though every instinct screamed against it. "Whatever's happening here, we need to document it." "Are you insane?" Dr. Whitmore grabbed her arm. "People have been disappearing in this place for 2 centuries. We're not researchers anymore, we're prey." But it was too late. As they argued, the shadows at the bottom of the ravine began to move, flowing upward like black water defying gravity. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and their breath began to fog despite the summer heat. And from somewhere in that rising darkness came the sound of footsteps, not walking toward them, but walking upward, climbing the sheer walls of the ravine with impossible ease. The ancient voice that spoke next didn't come from below. It came from all around them, from the stones themselves, in a language older than human memory, but somehow perfectly understood. "You have brought the map back to us. You have opened the door. Welcome to the Devil's Trough, where the screaming never ends, and the darkness has been waiting so very long to meet you." The last thing Victoria remembered was the sound of her own voice, joining the eternal chorus that echoed from the depths, a scream that would carry across the Appalachian Mountains for generations to come, warning others away from a place where the laws of nature had been broken and something ancient and hungry had learned to walk among the living. The rescue teams never found their bodies. But hikers still report hearing voices calling from Devil's Trough, voices with British accents speaking about impossible geological formations, Swedish voices describing sound frequencies that shouldn't exist, Canadian voices warning about electromagnetic anomalies, and Australian voices cataloging creatures that defy every law of science. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries sounds it shouldn't, you can hear Dr. Victoria Blackwood's voice echoing from the depths, still trying to document her findings, still describing the indescribable horrors that wait in the darkness below, forever trapped in a research expedition that will never end. The Devil's Trough remains on no official maps. The government has sealed all records of the disappearances. But the screaming continues, growing louder each year, as if the darkness below is preparing to rise and claim the world above. And somewhere in that ancient darkness, something that was once human continues to carve fresh symbols into living stone, marking the days until the door opens wide enough for the Devil's Trough to empty its contents onto the surface world, where the screaming will finally have room to grow. The discovery happened when Detective Jake Thompson from Vancouver PD found the abandoned recording equipment 3 weeks after Sadie Crowley vanished. The digital recorder was still running, its red light blinking like a dying heartbeat in the darkness of the old radio station. What he heard in those final minutes would make him request a transfer to traffic duty within a month. But let me start from when everything was still normal. Sadie Crowley had built her reputation as Canada's most fearless paranormal investigator. Her podcast, Echoes of the Unknown, had over 2 million subscribers across North America and Europe. British fans called her the Ghost Whisperer of the Great White North, while her Australian followers dubbed her bloody brilliant at scaring the hell out of people. The legend of Echo Ridge had haunted the small Ontario town of Millbrook for over 70 years. Local residents whispered about the abandoned radio station on the ridge, WMR-FM, which had mysteriously gone silent during a live broadcast on December 15, 1952. The DJ, a man named Robert Mitchell from Birmingham who'd immigrated to Canada after the war, had been mid-sentence when his voice simply stopped. The official report claimed equipment failure, but the townspeople knew better. They'd heard the sounds that night, not just from their radios, but echoing across the valley from the ridge itself. Sounds that made grown men lock their doors and mothers pull their children close. Sadie had received dozens of emails about Echo Ridge from her European fans, particularly from followers in Germany and France who claimed they'd researched similar phenomena in their own countries. A message from Dr. James Wellington, a professor at Oxford University studying electromagnetic anomalies, finally convinced her to investigate. The equipment readings from that night in 1952, he'd written, show patterns identical to cases we've documented in Scotland and Wales. Whatever happened at WKMR isn't isolated to Canada. On November 23rd, Sadie packed her recording equipment and drove the winding road to Echo Ridge. She planned to spend 3 days at the abandoned station, documenting everything for what she promised would be her most terrifying episode yet. Her final Instagram post, liked by thousands of followers from Los Angeles to London, showed her standing before the rusted WMR sign, ready to uncover the truth about Echo Ridge. Going live tomorrow night at midnight EST. This one's going to be unforgettable. She had no idea how right she was. The transcript of her final recording, recovered from the station and sealed by police for 6 months, tells the rest of the story. At 11:47 p.m., Sadie began her broadcast. Hello, night owls and thrill seekers. This is Sadie Crowley coming to you live from the abandoned WMR radio station on Echo Ridge, Ontario. For those just joining, I'm investigating the mysterious disappearance of DJ Robert Mitchell, who vanished during a live broadcast 70 years ago tonight. Her voice was steady, professional. The equipment readings here are unusual, she reported. My electromagnetic field detector has been going crazy since I set up. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, and I swear I can hear something. Then she stopped speaking for nearly 30 seconds. When she resumed, her voice carried a tremor that her regular listeners had never heard before. Did you hear that? Listeners, please tell me in the comments if you're picking up those voices. They're speaking English, but with an accent I can't place. Almost sounds old-fashioned. The recording quality began to deteriorate. Static crept in, but Sadie continued her investigation. I'm moving deeper into the station now. The main broadcast booth is just ahead. According to the police reports, this is where Robert Mitchell was sitting when he disappeared. The microphone is still here, covered in 70 years of dust. Her footsteps echoed in the empty building. Wait, something's different. The dust on the microphone, it's been disturbed. There are fingerprints here, fresh ones. But that's impossible. The police sealed this place after Mitchell vanished, and I'm the first person to get permission to enter in decades. A new sound entered the recording then. A low humming, like electrical equipment warming up. The old radio equipment, Sadie whispered, it's turning itself on. From London, a listener named Christopher Bennett would later tell police he'd been following the live stream when Sadie's voice suddenly changed. It wasn't her anymore, he said. The accent was different, older, like someone from the 1950s. But Sadie kept talking, unaware of the change. I can see lights flickering in the equipment. The on-air sign just illuminated. But there's no power to this building. I checked the electrical grid myself. This is impossible. Her breathing became rapid, panicked. The temperature is dropping fast. I can see my breath now. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Something is manifesting in this room, something powerful. Then came the voice that made Detective Thompson request his transfer. It wasn't Sadie speaking anymore, but a man with a British accent, calm and professional, as if he were simply continuing a radio show from 1952. Good evening, listeners. This is Robert Mitchell coming to you live from WKMR. I apologize for the brief interruption in our programming. We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties. Australian listener Kate Morrison, who had been recording the stream, told investigators that her blood ran cold when she heard those words. Robert Mitchell had been dead for 70 years. The voice continued using Sadie's equipment, but it wasn't Sadie anymore. We have a special guest with us tonight, folks. A young lady who's been very interested in our little radio station. She's asked so many questions about what happened that December night in 1952. Well, my dear, you're about to find out firsthand. That's when Sadie's real voice returned, but it was screaming. No. This isn't possible. You're dead. You've been dead for 70 years. Robert Mitchell's voice remained calm, almost amused. Death is such a limiting concept, don't you think? Here at WKMR, we've been broadcasting continuously since 1952. We just needed the right frequency to reach the living world again. And you, dear Sadie, have provided us with the perfect signal. The recording captured the sound of footsteps, running, then a door slamming. Sadie was trying to escape, but Mitchell's voice followed her through the building speakers. Where are you going, my dear? The show must go on. We have listeners all over the world waiting to hear how this story ends. Her screams echoed through the empty halls as she ran. The exit. I can see the exit. But when she reached the door, it wouldn't open. The recording picked up the sound of her pounding on the wood, sobbing. It's locked. The door is locked from the outside. But that's impossible. I came in through this door. I left it unlocked. Someone locked me in. Mitchell's laughter filled the broadcast. Not someone, dear. Something. Echo Ridge has been hungry for so long. 70 years of silence. Do you know how maddening silence can be for a radio station? From Germany, listener Heinrich Muller later reported that his radio had started picking up the WKMR signal during Sadie's broadcast, even though he lived thousands of miles away and the station had been dead for decades. Sadie's voice grew weaker. The cold, it's getting worse. I can't feel my fingers. The recorder is almost dead, but I have to keep talking. If anyone finds this, you need to know the truth about Echo Ridge. The station never went silent. It's been broadcasting on a frequency that only the dead can hear. Mitchell's voice grew stronger as Sadie's grew weaker. Welcome to the permanent staff, Miss Crowley. Don't worry, you'll find the work quite engaging. We broadcast every night at midnight, sharing stories with listeners you never knew existed. The recording captured Sadie's final words, barely a whisper. Tell my family I love them. Tell them I'm sorry I came here. Tell them to stay away from Echo Ridge. The signal is spreading. It's reaching more people every night. Soon, there won't be anywhere left that's truly silent." Then Robert Mitchell's voice returned, cheerful and professional. "Well, folks, that concludes tonight's special investigation. Miss Crowley has decided to join our permanent broadcasting team here at WKMR. Tune in tomorrow night at midnight for another exciting episode of Echoes from Echo Ridge. Until then, keep your radios close and your minds open. You never know what signals might be trying to reach you." The recording ended at 5:17 a.m. Detective Thompson found Sadie's equipment still running 3 weeks later, but Sadie herself was never found. The WKMR transmitter, which had been silent since 1952, was broadcasting again. Radio operators across Canada, the United States, and Europe began reporting strange signals on the old WKMR frequency. The strangest part? Every night at midnight, listeners across the world report hearing a familiar voice introducing herself. This is Sadie Crowley, coming to you live from Echo Ridge. Tonight, we have a very special guest who's been asking questions about our little radio station. The signal is getting stronger,